You are sitting alone after a conversation that seemed completely normal. Someone said something. You nodded. You smiled. You answered exactly the way you were expected to answer. Then the room went quiet, and for a brief second, something strange happened. A thought appeared that you immediately tried to push away, not because it was offensive, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt forbidden. The thought was simple. What if there are certain conversations I am avoiding because I already know they might change me? Most people think they are afraid of being wrong. They are not. Being wrong is uncomfortable, but it is survivable. What terrifies people is becoming someone different after discovering they were wrong. That is a completely different fear, because the moment a belief changes, a part of your identity changes with it. And identity is not something people surrender willingly. Think about the last time you encountered an idea that genuinely challenged you. Not an idea you laughed at. Not an idea you dismissed. Not an idea that was obviously ridiculous. An idea that made you uncomfortable because part of you suspected it might contain something true. What did you do? Did you explore it? Or did you immediately search for reasons to reject it? Most people like to imagine they are open-minded explorers of truth. Reality is often far less flattering. Many of us are lawyers defending conclusions we reached years ago. We collect evidence that supports our position. We ignore evidence that threatens it. We call it reasoning. Sometimes it is merely self-protection, and that is where this conversation begins. Not with what you believe, not with what is true, but with a far more uncomfortable question. What are you afraid to examine? Somewhere in your life there is probably a subject that creates tension the moment it appears. It might be about relationships. It might be about success. It might be about meaning. It might be about who you are when nobody is watching. You can feel the resistance before the conversation even starts. Your mind begins preparing defenses before any challenge has been made. Why? Because deep down, you understand something most people never admit. Some questions are not dangerous because they are false. They are dangerous because they force us to look at ourselves. If this feeling has ever crossed your mind, if there has ever been a question you secretly avoided because you were afraid of where it might lead, leave a comment and describe it. Not for anyone else, for yourself. Because naming a fear is often the first step toward understanding it. The strange thing about human beings is that we constantly claim to want truth while simultaneously building our lives around comfort. We say we want honesty, but we avoid honest conversations. We say we want answers, but only if those answers fit neatly into the story we already tell ourselves. Imagine a man who spends 20 years climbing a mountain because everyone around him insists that the summit contains everything he will ever need. Purpose, happiness, fulfillment, recognition. He sacrifices time, energy, relationships, opportunities. He struggles. He suffers. He keeps climbing because turning back would mean admitting that perhaps the entire journey was based on an assumption he never questioned. Then one day, halfway to the top, he notices something disturbing. Nobody seems certain that the summit actually contains what they promised. Some people are climbing because everyone else is climbing. Some are climbing because their parents climbed. Some are climbing because they are terrified of stopping. Suddenly he faces a choice: continue climbing and ignore the doubt, or stop and investigate. Which option do you think feels safer? Most people assume investigation feels safer. It does not. Investigation is terrifying. Investigation risks discovering that years of effort were invested in the wrong direction, and that possibility feels unbearable. So people keep climbing. Not because they are convinced, because they are committed. There is a difference, a massive difference. The longer we invest in an idea, the harder it becomes to question it. The longer we tell ourselves a story, the more painful it becomes to imagine another version of reality. This happens everywhere. In careers, in relationships, in personal identities, in belief systems, in dreams. Someone spends 10 years becoming a version of themselves that no longer makes them happy. Yet they continue, because they cannot bear the thought that those 10 years might have been built on a misunderstanding. The irony is devastating. The very thing that could free them becomes the thing they fear most. Consider a relationship that should have ended years ago. Both people know it. Both people feel it. Every conversation feels forced. Every interaction feels rehearsed. but neither leaves. Not because love is alive, because history is alive. They are not protecting the relationship. They are protecting the meaning of everything that came before it. And suddenly a terrifying realization emerges. Sometimes people do not stay because something is true. They stay because admitting it is false feels worse. Sit with that idea for a moment. How many areas of life operate according to that principle? How many beliefs survive not because they have been examined recently, but because examining them would be emotionally expensive? Here is the uncomfortable possibility that most people never explore. The strongest force shaping your worldview may not be logic. It may not be evidence. It may not be experience. It may be emotional investment. Once we become attached to a conclusion, our minds become remarkably creative at protecting it. We are experts at rationalizing, experts at explaining, experts at defending, yet surprisingly poor at questioning ourselves. And that is why certain conversations feel dangerous, not because they threaten truth, because they threaten identity. Imagine someone handing you a key and saying, "This key opens a door you have avoided your entire life." On the other side are answers. But there is a condition. Whatever you discover cannot be forgotten. Would you open the door? Most people immediately say yes, but would they really? Think carefully, because curiosity sounds noble until it carries consequences. We celebrate truth seekers in theory. In practice, truth can be disruptive. Truth can rearrange relationships. Truth can expose contradictions. Truth can force difficult choices. Truth can leave you standing alone in places where certainty once provided comfort. That is why the conversation you are supposedly not ready for may have nothing to do with information. It may have everything to do with courage. Courage is often misunderstood. People imagine courage as charging into danger. Sometimes courage is sitting quietly with a question you desperately want to escape. Sometimes courage is refusing to distract yourself when an uncomfortable realization begins forming. Sometimes courage is admitting that certainty feels good, but may not always be justified. There is another reason this conversation is difficult. Human beings build identities out of stories, not facts. Stories. The story of who we are. The story of why we suffer. The story of what we deserve. The story of where we belong. The story of what our lives mean. These stories become invisible because we repeat them so often. Eventually, they stop feeling like stories and start feeling like reality itself. But what happens when a crack appears? What happens when an experience contradicts the narrative? Most people do not change the narrative. They reinterpret the experience. The story must survive. The story always survives, at least for a while. Yet deep inside, tension begins growing. A quiet tension. The tension of knowing that something does not fit. The tension of carrying unanswered questions. The tension of pretending certainty while privately wrestling with doubt. If you have ever felt that tension, if you have ever found yourself lying awake at night replaying a question that refuses to disappear, write your perspective below. Because that experience is far more common than most people admit. Everyone sees confidence. Very few see the silent negotiations happening beneath it. And here is where things become even more uncomfortable. What if the questions you fear most are not obstacles? What if they are invitations? Not invitations toward a particular answer. Not invitations toward a specific belief. Invitations toward honesty. Genuine honesty. The kind that does not immediately rush toward conclusions. The kind that tolerates uncertainty. The kind that allows complexity to exist without demanding immediate resolution. Most people spend their lives trying to eliminate uncertainty. Yet some of the most important moments in human growth begin when certainty starts falling apart. Not because uncertainty is pleasant, because it creates space. Space for reflection, space for curiosity, space for possibilities that were previously invisible. Right now, as you listen, there may be a specific thought hovering in the background of your mind. A question, a contradiction, a suspicion. Something you rarely discuss with anyone. Something that feels too personal, too disruptive, or too uncomfortable to explore openly. You know exactly what it is, and perhaps that is why this conversation feels different, because the real subject has never been a philosophy, a doctrine, a theory, or an argument. The real subject is you, and before this conversation reaches the place it is ultimately leading, there is one realization that must be confronted first. The greatest barriers to understanding are rarely located outside us. They are often hidden within us, disguised as certainty, loyalty, comfort, habit, fear, and the stories we have repeated for so long that we no longer recognize them as stories at all. The difficult part is not discovering new answers. The difficult part is becoming willing to ask questions that might change everything. The moment that realization begins to settle in, most people instinctively reach for an escape. Not because they are weak, because uncertainty is exhausting. There is a reason distractions have become one of the most valuable commodities in modern life. The human mind was never designed to sit comfortably inside unanswered questions for long periods of time. It craves closure, it craves certainty, it craves the relief that comes from finally deciding what something means. That craving is powerful enough to make people choose a comforting answer over an honest investigation. You can see it everywhere. A person receives bad news and immediately searches for a simple explanation. A relationship ends and one partner desperately creates a story that turns confusion into certainty. Someone experiences suffering and begins constructing a narrative that makes the pain feel purposeful. None of this is unusual. In many ways, it is deeply human. The problem begins when our need for certainty becomes stronger than our desire to understand reality. That is where things become dangerous. Not dangerous in the dramatic sense, dangerous in the quiet psychological sense. The kind of danger that slowly shapes an entire life without ever announcing itself. Imagine a woman standing in front of a mirror every morning for 10 years. Each day, she repeats the same story about herself. Maybe the story is that she is not good enough. Maybe the story is that she always gets abandoned. Maybe the story is that she never belongs anywhere. At first, it feels like an interpretation. Eventually, it becomes an identity. Then one day, something unexpected happens. Someone enters her life and treats her differently. They see strength she never acknowledged. They recognize value she spent years ignoring. Suddenly, she faces a strange problem. The evidence in front of her conflicts with the story she believes. Most people assume this would feel liberating. Often it feels terrifying. Because if the story is wrong, then who has she been all these years? That question cuts deeper than most people realize. We often assume false beliefs are easy to abandon once evidence appears. Reality suggests otherwise. People become emotionally attached to their wounds, attached to their explanations, attached to their identities. Even painful identities can feel safer than uncertain ones. Think about that carefully. There are individuals who secretly prefer a familiar pain over an unfamiliar possibility. Not because pain is pleasant, because familiarity creates stability. The known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known is making them miserable. This is why certain conversations never happen. Not because nobody notices the contradictions. Everyone notices them. The real reason is that acknowledging them would require entering unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory demands vulnerability. Consider how often people avoid difficult discussions with themselves. They will spend hours analyzing the behavior of strangers online. They will debate politics, culture, philosophy, religion, success, relationships, and morality. Yet they rarely stop and ask the question that matters most. What if the person I understand least is myself? That question sounds simple until you genuinely attempt to answer it. Suddenly, layers begin appearing. Motivations you never noticed, fears hidden beneath confidence, desires disguised as principles, insecurities disguised as certainty. You begin realizing that much of what you assumed was objective may contain emotional influences you never recognized. This realization can feel humiliating at first, then it becomes liberating, because self-awareness is not the destruction of identity, it is the refinement of it. Yet reaching that stage requires passing through discomfort. There is no shortcut around it. A person who has never questioned themselves may appear confident, but confidence built upon unexamined assumptions is fragile. It only remains stable as long as reality cooperates. The moment reality pushes back, cracks begin appearing. That is why life often forces conversations we never wanted to have. A betrayal, a failure, a loss, a disappointment, a moment of loneliness, a dream that collapses. These experiences do something strange. They interrupt the stories we tell ourselves. Suddenly, the explanations that once felt sufficient no longer work. The old narrative struggles to account for the new reality. And for a brief moment before a replacement story forms, we encounter something rare. We encounter uncertainty. Most people rush through that moment as quickly as possible. They want answers. They want conclusions. They want emotional relief. But what if that moment is actually valuable? What if uncertainty is not merely the absence of answers? What if it is the doorway through which deeper understanding enters? Imagine a man who spent his entire life believing he understood success. He built everything around achievement, every decision, every sacrifice, every relationship. He convinced himself that fulfillment was waiting just beyond the next accomplishment. Then one day, he achieves the goal that dominated his imagination for years. He expects triumph. He expects satisfaction. He expects transformation. Instead, he feels strangely empty. The achievement arrives. The fulfillment does not. Suddenly, he confronts a question he never anticipated. If success was not what I thought it was, what else might I be wrong about? That question has the power to unravel an entire worldview. Not because success is meaningless, not because ambition is wrong, because assumptions are rarely as complete as we imagine. Every human being carries invisible assumptions about happiness, identity, meaning, love, purpose, suffering, and fulfillment. Most of those assumptions remain hidden until reality challenges them. Then the conversation begins. The real conversation. The one you cannot have while defending every conclusion you already hold. The one that requires curiosity instead of certainty. The one that demands honesty instead of performance. There is an interesting pattern that appears whenever people encounter information that threatens their worldview. They often believe they are evaluating the information. In reality, they are evaluating the emotional consequences of accepting it. That distinction matters a great deal, because it explains why intelligent people can look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions. They are not merely processing facts. They are protecting identities. They are protecting communities. They are protecting narratives. They are protecting futures they have already imagined. Remove those emotional factors, and many disagreements look very different. Yet removing them is almost impossible, because human beings are not machines. We do not experience ideas in isolation. We experience them through layers of emotion, memory, experience, loyalty, fear, hope, and personal meaning. This does not make us irrational. It makes us human. But it also means that the most difficult conversations are rarely intellectual. They are emotional, deeply emotional. Somewhere in your life, there is probably a belief you hold not only because you think it is true, but because life feels more manageable when it is true. There may also be a belief you reject, not only because you think it is false, but because accepting it would create discomfort. Again, this is not a criticism. It is an observation about the human condition. We are not detached observers of reality. We are participants. Every conclusion carries consequences. Every possibility carries emotional weight. That is why some questions feel heavier than others. Their answers threaten to reshape something important. Perhaps this is why people often say they are searching for truth, when what they are actually searching for is reassurance. Reassurance is comforting. Truth is unpredictable. Reassurance tells you what you already want to hear. Truth sometimes introduces possibilities you never wanted to consider, and this leads directly into one of the most uncomfortable realizations of all. Many people are not afraid that they might discover something false. They are afraid they might discover something true about themselves, something true about their motivations, something true about their fears, something true about the distance between the person they present to the world and the person they encounter when nobody else is around. That gap exists in almost everyone, the gap between appearance and reality, between confidence and doubt, between certainty and confusion, between the story and the person telling it. The larger the gap becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain. Eventually, life places pressure on it. Eventually, reality tests it. Eventually, a conversation arrives that cannot be avoided forever. And when that moment comes, something remarkable happens. The question is no longer whether you are ready for the conversation. The question becomes whether you are willing to hear what it reveals. Because once certain realizations emerge, they cannot be pushed back into darkness. Once you see a contradiction clearly, pretending not to see it becomes exhausting. Once you recognize a pattern, ignoring it requires constant effort. Once a question takes root, it rarely disappears simply because you want it to. It waits, quietly, patiently, sometimes for years. And the strangest part is that the questions we resist most often become the ones that transform us most profoundly. Not because they provide simple answers, because they force us into deeper engagement with reality. They force us beyond autopilot, beyond habit, beyond inherited assumptions, beyond comfortable narratives. They force us to become active participants in our own understanding. That journey is rarely pleasant, but it may be necessary, because there is a difference between living inside a story and understanding the story you are living inside. Most people never notice that distinction. The few who do often find themselves standing at the edge of a realization that changes everything, and that realization is closer than it appears. Now imagine reaching a point in life where the distractions stop working, not permanently, just long enough for silence to become unavoidable, long enough for the questions beneath the noise to become audible. Many people spend years believing they are moving forward when they are actually moving away from difficult memories, away from uncomfortable possibilities, away from unresolved conflicts, away from parts of themselves they do not want to confront. Movement can feel like progress even when it is escape. Activity can feel like purpose even when it is avoidance. The calendar fills up. The responsibilities multiply. The routines become automatic. And somewhere inside all of that motion, a person quietly loses contact with themselves. It rarely happens dramatically. It happens gradually, one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, one postponed question at a time. Then eventually something interrupts the pattern, a loss, a crisis, a failure, a moment of unexpected stillness. Suddenly the machinery of distraction slows down and a realization begins surfacing. The conversation you have been avoiding is not waiting somewhere outside you. It has been happening underneath everything all along. Every disappointment carried part of it. Every moment of doubt carried part of it. Every strange feeling that something was missing carried part of it. You simply kept finding ways not to listen. There is a reason certain moments remain vivid for decades. A conversation in a parking lot, a night staring at a ceiling unable to sleep, a drive home after receiving news that changed everything, a moment standing in a crowded room feeling completely alone. These experiences stay with us because they expose something beneath our routines. They reveal the gap between the life we are living and the life we are experiencing internally. Most people know that gap exists. Very few measure its size honestly. Think about how often people say they want authenticity while carefully protecting the masks that prevent it. The mask of certainty, the mask of confidence, the mask of success, the mask of having everything figured out. These masks are not signs of deception, they are survival strategies. Human beings desperately want belonging. We want acceptance. We want stability. We want to feel understood. Sometimes we become so focused on maintaining those things that we stop revealing who we actually are. Then something strange happens. The acceptance we receive begins feeling empty, because it is being offered to a version of ourselves that is only partially real. Imagine spending years building a beautiful house on unstable ground. From a distance, everything looks impressive. The structure stands tall. Visitors admire it. The appearance inspires confidence. Yet beneath the surface, cracks are spreading. At first, they are tiny, barely noticeable, easy to ignore. But every year they grow. Eventually, the problem is no longer cosmetic. The foundation itself demands attention. This is what unexamined assumptions do inside a human life. They remain invisible until pressure exposes them. And pressure always arrives eventually. The pressure of aging, the pressure of loss, the pressure of responsibility, the pressure of disappointment, the pressure of realizing that time is finite. There is something profoundly unsettling about recognizing that life does not wait for certainty. Years pass whether questions are answered or not. Opportunities disappear whether fears are confronted or not. Relationships evolve whether conversations happen or not. Time keeps moving. And perhaps that is why this conversation feels heavier than it initially appeared, because it is not really about a specific belief, philosophy, ideology, or conclusion. It is about the possibility that you have been postponing an encounter with yourself, the version of yourself that exists beneath the explanations, beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, beneath the stories. That encounter can be frightening because it removes excuses. It removes performance. It removes distractions. It asks a simple but devastating question. What remains when everything you use to define yourself is stripped away? Your job disappears. Your reputation disappears. Other people's opinions disappear. Your achievements disappear. Your failures disappear. What remains? Most people never seriously investigate that question because they are busy constructing identities rather than examining them. Yet sooner or later, life introduces circumstances that force the issue. A person spends decades chasing approval, only to discover that approval never created peace. Another spends years pursuing control, only to discover that control is temporary. Someone else builds their entire identity around being needed, then suddenly finds themselves alone. Each experience reveals the same uncomfortable truth. External structures can support identity, but they cannot replace self-understanding. And that realization often arrives much later than people expect. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It emerges when you realize that the explanations guiding your life no longer feel sufficient. Outwardly, everything may appear normal. Inwardly, a quiet revolution has begun. Questions appear where certainty once existed. Curiosity appears where assumptions once stood. Doubt appears, not necessarily as a sign of weakness, but as evidence that deeper examination has started. Many people fear doubt because they associate it with instability. Yet doubt can serve an important purpose. Not all doubt destroys. Some doubt reveals. Some doubt exposes weaknesses in our thinking that confidence was hiding. Some doubt forces us to investigate areas we previously ignored. Some doubt becomes the beginning of wisdom rather than its enemy. The problem is that doubt feels uncomfortable, and human beings are remarkably skilled at escaping discomfort. We scroll, we consume, we argue, we distract ourselves, we stay busy, anything to avoid sitting quietly with unresolved tension. Yet the unresolved tension remains. It waits beneath the surface, and every once in a while it returns with greater intensity than before. Maybe you have experienced that. Maybe you have felt a question return repeatedly across different stages of life. Different circumstances, different years, different versions of yourself. The details change, but the underlying tension remains. That persistence is worth paying attention to. Some questions refuse to disappear because they point towards something unfinished. Not necessarily an answer, an understanding, a deeper level of honesty, a part of yourself that still wants to be acknowledged. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume self-discovery is about finding comforting conclusions. Often it is about losing illusions. Illusions about who we are. Illusions about why we do what we do. Illusions about what will finally make us feel complete. Losing illusions rarely feels pleasant, yet clinging to them carries its own cost. The cost is living at a distance from reality. And reality has a habit of collecting debts. The longer something remains unexamined, the more influence it tends to accumulate. Unquestioned fears shape decisions. Unquestioned assumptions shape relationships. Unquestioned stories shape identities. Eventually, entire lives can emerge from foundations that were never consciously chosen. That possibility should unsettle anyone willing to consider it seriously. How much of your life was consciously examined? How much was inherited? How much was assumed? How much was repeated until it felt true? These are not accusations. They are invitations. Invitations to investigate, invitations to become curious about your own mind, invitations to recognize that understanding yourself may be one of the most difficult and rewarding challenges you will ever face. And here is the realization toward which everything has been pointing. The conversation you thought you were not ready for may never become comfortable. There may never be a perfect moment. There may never be complete certainty. There may never be a day when all fear disappears and every question suddenly feels manageable. Readiness is often misunderstood. People imagine readiness as confidence. Sometimes readiness is simply willingness. The willingness to look, the willingness to question, the willingness to remain present when uncomfortable possibilities emerge, the willingness to value honesty over immediate comfort. That willingness changes everything. Because the moment you stop asking whether you are ready and start asking whether you are willing, the entire conversation transforms. It stops being a threat. It becomes an exploration. It stops being something happening to you. It becomes something you participate in. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all. The title of this conversation suggested that you were not ready. But if you have followed this journey all the way here, if certain ideas have lingered in your mind, if certain questions have become impossible to ignore, then maybe the truth is not that you were unprepared. Maybe the truth is that a part of you has been preparing for this conversation for much longer than you realized. Maybe every doubt, every contradiction, every restless thought, every moment of curiosity, every uncomfortable realization was quietly leading here, not toward a final answer, not toward certainty, but toward something far more valuable. The courage to examine your own life honestly. And once that courage appears, even briefly, you may discover that the most important conversation you were avoiding was never with the world. It was with yourself.